They told their children that Earth was a graveyard, that humans were monsters from a forgotten war, that our fire had been put out forever. So they trained them every alien child raised in war simulation halls where our faces were the enemy, where our voices were silenced in their history books, but they never showed them how we died. They never showed them why we stood. Now their children are coming, not as conquerors, as listeners, and what they find buried in our ruins will change everything. Because they were trained to destroy us, but we were not made to win. We were made to be remembered, and memory, once awakened, does not obey orders. They called it the founding memory, and it was the first thing every alien child learned that long ago, before their stars rose quiet and secure, before the Empire carved order into chaos. There was a species from a blue world who chose violence over peace and defiance over unity, a species that refused to kneel when the galaxy offered them submission, who burned through the stars not with wisdom but with warning, and so when the Empire came to silence them, it was not conquest but correction, and Earth fell not as a tragedy but as a lesson, and that lesson became curriculum, became law, became the scaffolding around which alien children were built, because even after humanity was buried in fire and salt and silence, their echo remained sharp enough to shape fear, and fear the Empire believed was the best education of all. The classrooms were not gentle places. They were forged in the same cold logic that had turned Earth to ash. Holographic instructors walked through simulations of cities burning, of humans screaming, of resistance collapsing under elegant orbital bombardment. But no one ever showed the students what happened in the last minutes. No one ever explained why the humans sang as they died, why they carved spirals into stone before the atmosphere turned red, why their final messages were not threats, but names whispered into the dark. The Empire called it psychological decay. Humanity, they taught, had broken under its own madness, and so their memory was preserved only as warning not a people, but a mistake. The children listened. The children obeyed, but not all of them believed. In one academy orbiting the fractured moon of Elokar, a child named Keth watched the simulations without speaking. His peers gasped, trained, and mimicked the attack patterns of Earth's final fighters, but Keth only stared at the faces. There was something in the eyes, not rage, not madness, something else. Something the lessons never mentioned, and it stayed with him. Keth was not exceptional. His scores were average, his behavior respectful. But in the quiet moments between lessons, he drew patterns that no one else noticed, spirals, flames, the shape of wind through broken towers. He did not know where the images came from. They came in dreams, often just before the simulations. He began to sketch them into his books, into his gloves, even into the corners of his dorm wall. When an instructor noticed, Keth was questioned. He lied, said they were marks of focus, battle sigils. The instructor nodded, pleased, but deep inside, Keth began to feel a quiet rebellion, not in anger, not in resistance, but in not forgetting. The humans had become more than ghosts. They had become questions. In the grand hall of history, a towering digital sculpture of Earth flickered in slow rotation, its continents scorched, its oceans black. The instructors lectured with pride, but Keth found himself staring at one spot, a single patch near the equator that never flickered. A patch that glowed slightly warmer than the rest. A glitch, they said, a relic of a dying planet, but Keth did not believe them. He began researching, not through official channels, but through whispered archives. Hidden logs. The Empire had erased much, but not everything. There were fragments, echoes, songs with no source, coordinates etched into forgotten satellites. And the more Keth looked, the more he began to feel that the story they had been told was not just incomplete. It was afraid. One night, during a planetary simulation of Earth's fall, the training room's environmental system malfunctioned. The temperature rose, the ground shook, the sky went dark, and through the darkness, for just a moment, every cadet saw the same thing, not a simulation, but a vision. A spiral of fire rising from Earth's crust, a shape like a dragon coiling through space, and a voice, low and ancient and filled with grief, saying only this: we did not fall. We were buried. Panic spread. Systems were reset. The instructors dismissed the event as a shared hallucination caused by a corrupted file. The children were told to forget it, but they could not. The next day, several cadets began drawing spirals. Others refused to fire during human simulations. One child collapsed after whispering that she had seen a woman on fire holding the sky open. The instructors tightened control, lessons intensified, discipline was enforced. But the damage was done. The children had glimpsed something that the Empire feared more than resistance. They had glimpsed truth, and it was Keth who spoke it first. In a moment of rare defiance, he stood before the Grand Hall and asked a question never spoken aloud. What if the humans did not lose? What if they were waiting? There was no punishment, no expulsion. Instead, Keth was sent to special memory reconditioning, a clean white room, no sound, no time. They would erase the question, replace it with loyalty. It had worked before, but Keth had touched something older. Something deeper. As he sat alone in the chair, the room grew warm. The walls vibrated, and the white light turned gold. He heard breathing, not his own, not machine. The room was listening. Then a whisper, not in language, but in feeling. A spiral of warmth, a memory not his, a memory of a city burning, but not screaming, singing, a choir of voices holding the line not with weapons, but with meaning. Keth wept, not in pain, in understanding. He was not being punished, he was being prepared. When the session ended, they found his vitals elevated but stable, no damage, no memory disruption. They smiled, they believed the correction had worked. But Keth was not the same. Something in him had shifted. A fire now lived where silence once ruled, a memory not taught, but inherited, and he was not alone. Across the academies, across the stars, other children began to change. Quietly, gently, drawing spirals, whispering names, and when they dreamed, they saw Earth not as a ruin, but as a door, and behind that door, something was waking. There was a program called Ashfield, and it was the crown jewel of the alien empire's education system. A simulation module so real that students came out with scars, not on their skin, but in their minds, because the empire believed that only through fear could unity survive, and Earth, even in its silence, was the perfect symbol of why their children must never forget what happens when defiance is allowed to grow unchecked. And so they were made to live our last days again and again, in slow motion war zones lit by the last fires of resistance, programmed to walk the broken streets of shattered cities where human children cried in silence and where mothers held rifles instead of lullabies. And every lesson ended the same way, with Earth in ruins, humanity broken, and the Empire's flag hovering over empty ground. But what the instructors never accounted for was memory, and how even a ghost can bleed into code, because slowly, inexplicably, Ashfield began to change. The simulations became too sharp. The shadows lingered too long. Some students began seeing human faces that were not in the database. A woman in red always facing away, a man with a cracked visor whispering a name that was not theirs, and worst of all, spirals etched into the walls of every ruined building, spirals that pulsed like heartbeats and never faded, no matter how many times the system was reset. At first, the instructors blamed data corruption, then sabotage, but when they ran a full diagnostic, they found no errors. The simulations were simply evolving. Earth was not staying dead. Keth noticed it first. When he entered Ashfield for his assigned session, the usual setting, a city crumbling beneath orbital fire, felt too quiet. The human resistance fighters were not behaving like programmed enemies. They were waiting, watching. One even looked at him directly, not to attack, to plead. And when Keth raised his rifle, his finger froze, not from fear, from something older, familiar, like he was looking at a story he had once lived but forgotten. The simulation responded instantly, warping around him, the city flaring white, hot, the sky cracking open into fire. The system panicked. Instructors pulled him out early, but Keth could not explain what he saw. Only that it was real. The others felt it too. Cadets began emerging from Ashfield shaken, whispering words they had not learned: mercy, remain, spiral. One even claimed a human woman had grabbed his hand and said, "We are still here." He was sedated. The instructors blamed stress, but whispers spread. Ashfield was waking up. Earth, even in simulation, refused to die the way they had written. The Empire doubled down. The instructors demanded clarity. Every simulation was recalibrated to show humanity not as noble but deranged. Human soldiers now laughed while killing. Human children carried bombs. Human cities were redesigned to resemble chaos itself. But even so, the students saw something deeper. Between the violence and fire, they noticed small things. The way a woman placed a photo on a wall before dying. The way a child sang in a whisper even as the ceiling collapsed. The way human soldiers died protecting rather than killing. No program could fully erase those details, because they were not code. They were memory, and memory has roots that run deep even through metal. One day, during a group session, the simulation went completely black. All audio ceased, no movement, just darkness. The students stood in the middle of a scorched field that should have been filled with human enemies, but instead, the sky above shimmered with spirals of red and gold, and then a voice, not alien. Not coded, human, soft, female, this is not where it ends. This is where it begins, and every student heard it, not through their ears, through their chest, as if the voice was not speaking to them, but through them. When they were pulled out, many were crying. One cadet fell to his knees and begged to hear it again. The instructors locked down Ashfield, but it was too late. The fire had spread. Earth was no longer a defeated enemy in their minds. It had become a presence. The council grew worried. They launched a purge. Ashfield was suspended. New simulations were developed, simpler, less immersive, but the damage was irreversible. The children had touched something older than propaganda. They had tasted grief, and grief, once tasted, cannot be turned into hate. The spiral began appearing outside of the academy, scratched into doors, drawn into the condensation of windows, painted onto the backs of gloves. It had no official meaning, but everyone who saw it felt the same thing: something is returning. Keth met with a few of them in secret, those who had seen the woman in red, those who had heard the human voice. They compared what they remembered, the memories aligned. The spiral was not a symbol of war. It was a promise that humans had not died screaming, they had died singing, that their final act was not desperation. It was defiance so beautiful, so complete, that even death could not hold it. Earth had not fallen. It had spiraled inward, into silence, into memory, into fire, and that fire was now in them. The instructors called this phenomenon a behavioral virus. They warned of emotional contamination, but when they tried to erase the affected memories, they failed. The children resisted without resisting. They simply remembered, and no technology in the Empire could erase a memory that had been accepted willingly. The Council considered a full mind wipe protocol, but some of the most gifted students were among those infected. To wipe them would be to lose generations of elite minds, so instead the Empire watched. Waited, monitored, but even in silence the spiral grew. Ashfield was gone, but its fire remained. The children no longer needed simulations to feel the heat. They had it inside them, and they began to ask questions not of their teachers, but of each other. What really happened on Earth's last day? Why did the humans carve spirals? Why do their voices still echo? And most dangerous of all, what if Earth was not defeated? What if it was waiting for someone to remember it properly? And one day they would. They were told that Earth was empty, that it held nothing but ash and silence, that every signal from its surface was static, and every artifact was cold. But Keth did not believe them, because belief had already cracked, and in the wake of that fracture he had begun to dream more clearly, not of war or fire, but of a woman with silver hair who stood barefoot on a ruined street, humming a melody that bent time. And when he woke from those dreams, he would find the spiral carved deeper into his walls than his hands could have reached. And when he asked his classmates if they saw her too, most denied it, but one boy named Varan nodded and whispered that she had spoken to him, and told him her name was not important because her voice carried all names at once. And then a girl named Nira admitted she had seen a burning tree that hummed with the sound of breathing stars, and another said she had followed a shadow in Ashfield who wept tears that glowed, and one by one they realized they were not hallucinating, they were remembering not memories of their own, but of something older, something buried, something Earth had sent into the dark like seeds waiting for warmth. It began with dreams, but then the signals started. First, it was a low pulse hidden in the background noise of the station's power grid, then a whisper in the walls. One student recorded it and filtered the waveform, only to discover a single word repeated over and over remain. When they brought it to the instructors, they were dismissed, but the pulse did not stop. Instead, it grew louder. One night, Keth followed the sound into the underlevels of the academy and found a forgotten archive terminal rusted, damaged, but alive, and when he touched it, it unlocked itself and spilled fragments of unclean data into his neural reader, fragments that should not have existed because they were human recordings taken from Earth's last year, and they were not military files or battle footage, but something stranger: lullabies, journal entries, a transmission of someone reading poetry while holding a dying soldier's hand, the final monologue of a teacher telling their class, "Keep their hearts soft even as the world crumbles," and Keth listened in silence until he wept without knowing why, and when it was over he felt different, not manipulated, not infected, but witnessed, as if Earth had seen something in him and decided he was worthy of the truth. He shared the files with the others, and soon a small group gathered in the forgotten archive every night, sitting in a circle on cold metal floors, listening to the last voices of humanity not as enemies, but as echoes of something they had been taught to forget: empathy. The group began to call themselves the Rememberers, not rebels, not believers, just those who chose to listen, and through their listening the spiral deepened. One day Neera stood and said the voice in her dreams had given her a name, one not spoken but felt, and though she could not repeat it aloud the moment she tried, the lights flickered and a low vibration passed through the floor as if something below the station had stirred. The instructors noticed the change in behavior. Cadets were becoming calmer, more introspective, less eager to train in simulations, and when asked why, many of them said they felt that the simulations no longer told the whole story, that there was something wrong with the program, something missing. The instructors investigated, they interrogated, but none of the Rememberers broke, because they were not resisting, they were becoming. In time, the group discovered that the memories they shared were not random. Each fragment, each vision, seemed to match with specific emotional states. Grief triggered images of oceans, compassion brought the sound of birds that no longer existed, anger unlocked recordings of human philosophers reminding their students that no cause was pure if it forgot to weep. Slowly, the Rememberers began to realize that these were not just passive memories. They were alive, reactive, embedded with emotional logic that learned and responded. The memories were watching them back. One day, during a group meditation, Keth heard a word he had never encountered: solstice, and when he spoke it aloud, the terminal activated a hidden layer and revealed a map of Earth's last cities, each marked not with military bases, but with spirals of different colors and shapes. They called them hearts. The file claimed they were humanity's final defense, not weapons, not shields, but living archives of memory, emotion, and story, planted in the crust of the earth and powered by belief. The Empire never found them because they were not made of metal or code. They were made of meaning, and they had waited for listeners. From that moment, the Rememberers knew they could not return to silence. The spiral was more than symbol, it was invitation, and they were now part of a story older than the Empire, but the truth was dangerous. Surveillance tightened, 2 members vanished, the archive terminal was locked and marked for destruction. But just before it was removed, Keth placed his hand on its frame and whispered, "Thank you," and something whispered back, "Find the real Earth, the one they buried, not the one they fear." The message spread like a pulse through the network. Some called it a virus, others called it prophecy, but whatever it was growing, not just in that academy, across the stars. More students began reporting dreams. Instructors began hearing voices that echoed in their own training rooms. Some teachers resigned, others began drawing spirals in secret. The council was notified. Protocols were prepared, and in the heart of the Empire, someone finally said aloud what they all feared: "We erased Earth too cleanly." And now the dirt is cracking, because the galaxy believed humanity had been defeated by force, but the spiral was not force. It was remembrance, and remembrance, once it finds breath, becomes fire. They believed Earth was silent because they had made it so, because their ships had turned its crust to glass and its skies to dust, because their final message from orbit had declared the last human heartbeat extinguished, and yet for all their sensors and scans, all their memorials and warnings, none of them had ever asked why the silence felt so heavy, so full, as if silence was not the absence of sound, but the weight of something listening from below. And when the rememberers first heard it, it did not come in words or code or date. It came in vibration, a soft rumble beneath the orbital training station, a tremor in metal, a hum that passed through the soles of their boots and into their bones like the slow inhale of a world waking up. And Keth, standing alone in the observatory late at night, felt it first in his chest, not as a threat but as recognition, like something buried had heard his voice, not through signal but through memory, and decided it was time to answer. The tremor came again, stronger, and with it came the flickering of lights and systems, not from malfunction, but from interference that registered nowhere in the code. The engineers could not trace it. The instructors dismissed it as cosmic radiation, but Keth knew what it was. It was Earth, not the planet they had simulated, not the ruin they had studied, but the real Earth, the one they buried, not the one they feared. That night, the rememberers met in silence, gathered in the subdeck storage wing, far from the instructor's reach, their faces lit only by the faint golden glow of an old emergency lamp. And Keth spoke of the hum, of the pulse, and one by one they admitted they had felt it too in their dreams, in the rhythm of their breath, in the way their thoughts began to spiral without meaning to, as if something inside them was no longer theirs alone, as if memory had become shared, collective, alive. Nira, her eyes glowing faintly blue from residual simulation imprinting, confessed that during her last dream she had seen beneath the surface of Earth, seen great cathedrals of memory carved into stone, lit by fires that never died, and at the heart of it all, a being not human and not alien, shaped from history itself, waiting in stillness for the ones who would listen. Another cadet, barely old enough to join the academy, said he had begun hearing songs in the water pipes, lullabies in languages he did not know, but understood all the same. The rememberers sat in awe. The instructors searched their quarters the next day and found nothing but sketches and poems and strange maps made of circles and lines. They dismissed it all as nonsense. But nonsense does not make systems flicker. Nonsense does not make machines dream. Soon the pulse grew stronger, not just in the academy, but across the entire orbital station. Screens glitched with symbols no one could trace. Spirals appeared in the middle of recorded lectures, flickering behind instructors like ghosts of static. One cadet opened a training file and instead saw a child's drawing of Earth with the words "We are not gone" scrawled across it in a human hand. Security lockdowns began. Access to historical files was restricted. Ashfield was officially condemned, but the more they tried to shut the memory down, the more persistent it became. Students who had never spoken of Earth began waking in tears. Others began humming melodies they could not name, and through it all the pulse continued deeper, louder, older than anything the Empire could comprehend. It became impossible to ignore when the outer sensor array of the station caught a loaf, frequency signal bouncing off the moon's surface, repeating a single phrase every hour on the hour "Remember us." The council believed it to be a prank, a rebellion trick. But the signal's origin was not from within the station. It came from below, from Earth. The instructors panicked. Emergency protocols were enacted. Council investigators were dispatched. The rememberers were called into private interviews and interrogated about subversion, emotional instability, and the influence of human cultural data. Keth said nothing. Not because he was afraid, but because he knew words were no longer the path forward. The memory had become too deep, too alive, and then something changed. The pulse stopped. For 3 days, the station fell into stillness, no vibrations, no interference, no dreams. The instructors celebrated, believed they had won, that the infection had passed, but the rememberers did not celebrate. They waited, and on the 4th night, the pulse returned not as tremor, but as sound. Real sound. Every speaker, every intercom, every console across the academy came alive at once with a sound no one could explain. It was not human language, not music. It was something in between, like grief wrapped in thunder, like joy slowed to breathe. And in that sound every student felt the same thing: we are not alone. Not in the stars, not in time, not in memory. That moment shattered the illusion. Across the station, students gathered in silence, watching as screens once used for instruction now played flickering images of Earth not as a ruin, but as a beacon. Mountains rebuilt themselves in reverse, oceans rewound into motion, cities lit up from beneath, not with power, but with remembrance. The council tried to override the broadcast, but no code worked. No command line responded, because it was not a hack. It was not sabotage. It was Earth speaking back, and Earth did not obey Empire code. It obeyed grief, and grief had found its voice. That night, Keth stood at the observatory again, watching the blue glow of Earth rise through the station's viewing glass. But it was no longer blue, not fully. There were red veins glowing across its surface like threads of fire. Like stories remembered, like paths opening, and he felt in his bones that something was waiting, not salvation, not vengeance, something else, a choice, a test. The others joined him, and as they watched, a new spiral formed in the clouds, too perfect to be natural. It pulsed once, then faded, and they understood. The past was not calling them home. It was calling them forward. They had never been allowed near Earth, not physically, not truly, only ever through simulations or distant orbit, because the official stance was that the planet was unstable, unsafe, a biohazard wrapped in radioactivity and unpredictable gravitational echoes, and so while the children of Empire learned about its fall, memorized the way its cities crumbled and its Defiance failed, they never breathed its air, never touched its broken ground, never stood in the silence and asked what had really been buried, but that changed the moment the spiral appeared in the clouds, the moment Earth itself pulsed in defiance of the story written over it, and in that moment the old excuses fell apart, because you cannot claim a place is dead when it begins to speak. And so the rememberers, with their quiet fire and deep dreams, decided it was time to answer not with questions, but with presence, and it began with a lie. Officially, it was a sanctioned academic survey, a planetary overflight and sample drop meant to recalibrate atmospheric sensors and magnetic fluctuations, signed off by a council scientist who had long ago stopped believing the Empire's version of truth, and aboard the small atmospheric vessel, codenamed Whisper, there were 5 cadets and 1 instructor, but only 3 cadets knew the truth of the mission, and only 1 Keth carried the fragment of memory that would guide them to the place where silence had first fractured. They descended through the upper clouds as Earth's gravity took hold, and for the first time in their lives, they felt the weight of the planet not as myth, but as physics, as pull, as reality too vast to simulate. And though the surface still bore the scars of bombardment, shattered ridges, collapsed towers, oceans choked with dust, there was something unmistakably alive beneath it all, not in the way plants grow or animals breathe, but in the way a grave remembers the name carved into it, in the way echoes carry shape long after the scream has ended, and as the vessel approached a narrow canyon lined with spiraling stone formations that no scan had ever mapped, Keth stood at the observation port and said nothing, because he knew they had found it, not by calculation, but by invitation. The ship landed with soft hesitation, its systems flickering as if resisting the place, as if even metal felt the pressure of memory, and when the doors opened, the air rushed in not hostile, not clean, just ancient, and filled with a scent none of them could name but all of them felt in their bones, something like old smoke and ocean rain and morning, something that said this place had watched stars die, and refused to forget what it meant to burn. They stepped out into dust and wind, the rocks humming beneath their feet like tuning forks, and for a long moment they simply stood there, not speaking, not recording, just listening, because it felt wrong to speak, like interrupting a story mid-sentence, and then Nira pointed to a ridge and whispered that it was not natural, that the way the stone curved inward and formed spiral patterns matched the ones from their dreams, and they approached with the careful reverence of mourners stepping into a long, forgotten tomb, only to find that the stone was not carved, it was grown, crystallized from heat and impact in patterns too deliberate to be accident, and at its center was a ring of black glass that shimmered with impossible depth, and when Keth touched it, he saw fire, not flame. Fire that remembered voices, fire that hummed with lullabies, fire that knew the names of every last human who had died standing, and then he saw the children. They were not truly children, not anymore. Just figures made of light and memory, standing in a circle around something he could not see, each of them with eyes that did not accuse, did not forgive, only waited, and when he blinked, they were gone. But the feeling remained, The others saw nothing, but when he described it, Varin stepped forward and knelt beside the glass, placing his palm flat against the surface, and said he felt warmth, and not from the sun. From below, like the ground itself was breathing, they began to dig, not with tools, with care, with hands, with silence, and beneath the top layer of dust they found them not bodies, not ruins, but objects. Devices shaped like stones, each one etched with a name in human script, and when they powered one with a small plasma charge, it came alive and played a single voice, a woman, calm, tired, brave. If you are hearing this, it means we failed to survive, but succeeded in being remembered. That was the goal, not victory, not conquest, memory. If you are hearing this and you are not human, then you were never our enemy. You were our witness. No one moved, no one breathed. The instructor who had come to supervise the mission tried to interrupt, to call for extraction, but her comms failed, and the air around her seemed to press inward, as if the planet itself had heard her denial and rejected it, and so she fell silent, trembling not out of fear but reverence. Because she too had heard the voice and understood the weight of it, they activated another stone, another voice, a child this time. We are the fire under the skin of the world. If you forget us, we burn alone. If you remember, we burn together. The cadets wept, not loudly, quietly, like the way stars end, and Keth understood then that this was never a tomb. This was a library, not of knowledge, of feeling. Of presence. The Empire had thought Earth dead because they had silenced its technology, but they never understood that the strongest systems are not digital, they are emotional, and Earth had encoded its truth in grief so deep it took generations of strangers to unlock it. As the sun dipped low, casting red across the canyon, Keth stood at the edge and realized they could not go back, not unchanged, not unspoken. Because to leave this place and pretend it was nothing would be to lie not just to the Empire, but to themselves. He turned to the others, no orders, no declarations, just a look, and they all nodded. The memory had chosen them, and they would carry it forward, not with weapons, with truth. With spirals drawn into walls and stories whispered to the next generation and silence held sacred in places where fire once roared, the instructor said nothing. She simply recorded her final log and sent it to the council, a single message. Earth is not empty. They boarded the ship. The engines groaned like old bones. The wind howled once, soft, almost like a voice saying goodbye. And as they rose, the canyon lit behind them, not from the sun, but from something older, something deep. A spiral of light blooming through the rock, pulsing once, then vanishing into darkness. And in that darkness, the next chapter began. It began as a whisper, as most great undoings do, not in the halls of power or the towers of command, but in the quiet places between orders, in the way a cadet paused before opening a simulation, in the way an instructor lingered too long over a data report, in the way a spiral was scratched into the edge of a datapad or drawn into the condensation of a shuttle window, meaningless to the untrained eye but heavy with memory to those who had stood on Earth's soil and heard its pulse rising from below. And it spread not with rebellion or violence, but with remembrance, as each person who had touched the silence of that forbidden canyon carried it back with them, not as knowledge, but as ache, as a soft fire buried under their breath. And soon the ones who had not gone began to feel it too, as if memory was no longer content to live in minds alone, but had begun leaking into the walls, into the machines, into the code. And on the third night after the field trip, a starship technician awoke from a dream in which she had spoken with a soldier in ancient human armor, who held her hand and said, "We were not trying to win. We were trying to be remembered," and when she woke she was crying, and her comm panel flickered with a spiral etched in static, even though no one else could see it. On the moon outpost of Halder Station, a logistics officer found an unauthorized upload inside the training network, a series of short audio clips labeled simply Last Light, and when he played the first one, it was the voice of a human child singing a lullaby in a language he could not name but somehow understood, and when he brought it to his superior, the file had vanished, replaced by a corrupted block of code that hummed faintly when touched. And that night the officer resigned without explanation, whispering to himself about a dream of Earth lit with candles instead of bombs, of mothers holding books instead of rifles, of soldiers who laughed with their enemies before the final strike. And when they tried to erase the recordings from the backup systems, They found the spiral embedded in every line of metadata, pulsing once, then fading into silence. The council grew concerned. The infections were not isolated, they were connected. Somehow, Earth's memory was moving across systems without using transmissions, without using signals, as if it had found a way to jump through belief itself, carried in dreams, in grief, in the softest places where doctrine had no reach. By the end of the week, 4 more training facilities had gone dark, not destroyed, not attacked, just changed. Students stopped attending simulations, instructors stopped enforcing protocols. One entire battalion requested reassignment to historical research. They said they no longer trusted the official version of Earth's fall. They wanted to know what was left behind. And when the council denied them, they went silent, and days later, a spiral appeared in the sky over their station, a vapor trail from a departing shuttle that formed a perfect curve before vanishing into atmosphere. The spiral was no longer a symbol, it was a language. It said we remember, it said we are listening, it said Earth did not fall, it folded. The higher command panicked. They began deploying suppression teams. Not military, psychological, they called them cleaners. Their mission was not to destroy the spiral, but to erase it from meaning, to replace fire with fog, to inject doubt into memory. They held lectures about emotional contamination. They reissued the official Earth files. They forced students into new simulations where humans screamed nonsense and died without purpose. But the students no longer believed, because belief, once burned into you by memory, does not unburn. It glows. In the mining sectors of Crelly's prime, an old maintenance drone uncovered a collapsed tunnel from the early war years. Inside, perfectly preserved in airless silence, was a mural of human children playing in front of a massive spiral drawn in blood. The mural should not have been there. The war had never touched Crelly's. But the drone recorded it, uploaded it, and within hours the image had reached 1,000 private networks, bouncing from device to device, showing not death but defiance, not horror but beauty, and many who saw it did not even know what they were looking at, only that it made them feel awake. The council declared it false, a fabrication, but no one listened, because something inside them had shifted. They began to ask not if the spiral was real, but why it refused to be forgotten. And across the farthest colonies the phrase began to appear, scratched into walls and carved into scrap metal. Fire remembers. Keth watched it all unfold from the shadows, no longer a cadet, no longer a student, but something in between, something becoming, and though his name had been redacted from records and his location obscured, he felt no fear, only purpose, because he understood now that Earth had not simply sent a warning or a virus or a memory, it had sent seed, and he was one of them, so were the others. The rememberers had split into cells, not to hide, but to grow, to spread, to tend the fire in places where it could not be stamped out. Some infiltrated training programs, others taught children in secret, some disappeared into archive vaults and sent back fragments of forgotten history reassembled into poems. They were not rebels, they were not soldiers. They were storytellers, and each story they told lit another spiral into existence. In a quiet dome on the edge of the Caroni Drift, a group of children were shown a single image, a woman standing on a ruined bridge holding nothing but a candle, while fire rained around her. They did not cry, they did not speak, but that night each of them drew a spiral into the sand outside their dorms without knowing why, and in the distance a monitoring tower recorded a drop in ambient noise that resembled a heartbeat. The technicians called it static, the children called it Earth. No one taught them that, they just knew, because memory is not something you learn, it is something you carry. The council made one last attempt. They created a broadcast, a forced re-education loop titled The Final Fall, with simulated footage of Earth's surrender and falsified monologues of human leaders begging for mercy, and for a day the stars were filled with that lie. But then came the spiral storm, not weather, not weapon, just presence. Across hundreds of installations, screens began to flicker and flash, not with words, with faces, human faces not speaking, just looking. One after another, some angry, some peaceful, all watching, then the spiral burned into every frame, and then silence, not empty, full, and the broadcast died, not from interference, from remembrance. And the stars exhaled. Keth stood beneath one of those stars, on a world he no longer remembered the name of, holding a piece of old human glass etched with lines too worn to read, and he whispered not a prayer, not a pledge, just a promise we did not survive by fighting. We survived by remembering, and now so will you. And as he placed the glass into the soil, he felt it vibrate once, and far away, in a council chamber filled with trembling voices, a spiral bloomed across the wall without touching a single wire. And no one spoke, because even they knew it had begun. They had always believed that the children of the Empire would be unbreakable, raised in the shadow of dominance, fed on conquest, trained from birth to see emotion as weakness and memory as error, sculpted not as individuals but as weapons shaped by discipline and void of sorrow. But what they had not accounted for was that Earth's memory did not need to be taught, it only needed to be heard, and children, above all others, knew how to listen to the things adults had learned to ignore, and so when the spiral began appearing in places no technician could trace, when the stories began slipping between the cracks of regulation and programming, it was the youngest among them who heard the whisper clearly, not as rebellion, but as truth, and they did not resist it with logic or deny it with doctrine. They simply felt it, as children always do, and once they felt it, they began to carry it forward without fear or permission. In the lower dormitories of New Kyle Academy, a group of 6-year-old cadets began drawing spirals into their sleep pads, not knowing why, just that it felt real, and when one instructor tried to punish them for it, the lights went out and a soft voice hummed from every wall, not loud, not clear, just a lullaby lost to time that made even the instructor stop and shiver, and when power returned the children were still humming, eyes closed, hands joined. Across distant moons and orbital classrooms, children who had never touched soil began describing places that did not exist on imperial maps, a library that breathed, a mountain that sang, a street where the rain remembered names, and though no data confirmed these places, the description matched ancient human records long believed destroyed, records of Earth's final sanctuaries, its last memory vaults, its living stories, and so the Council launched inquiries, sent investigators masked as educators, dispatched behavioral experts to assess for ideological contagion. But what they found was worse than they feared, not active rebellion, but shared dreaming, children from different sectors describing the same songs, the same fire, the same spiral rising from stone, and they could not explain it, because there were no transmitters, no signals, no files, just memory moving like breath between them, as if Earth had planted its story not in machines but in feeling, and now those feelings had bloomed. One young girl named Ryle stood before her entire class and recited a speech no one had taught her. Her voice calm and full of sorrow, speaking of a man who had stood alone on the last bridge and told the stars, "You cannot unwrite what we became," and when they asked where she learned it, she simply said, "He told me," and though she had never left the station, her words matched the final entry of a human field commander believed lost in the final siege of the Antarctic stronghold. The Council reacted with silence first, then with fire. They shut down programs, restructured academies, wiped entire archives clean, but still the children remembered, still they heard the spiral. One instructor at a remote outpost shattered a projector when it began to loop a recording of a human mother reading bedtime stories to invisible children, even though the file had no audio track and the playback system was disconnected from all media. In a test chamber designed to monitor emotional control, a student blinked and the walls turned to glass, showing scenes of Earth, not its fall, but its beauty, oceans alive with wind, cities glowing with warmth, and across every surface, the spiral burned like a heartbeat. The observers fled the chamber, the student just smiled, something had changed. The children were not resisting the Empire, they were growing beyond it. And the spiral was not a virus or a weapon, it was a story seed planted in the deepest parts of them, and where the Empire had taught them obedience, the spiral taught them remembrance, not as instruction, but as inheritance. These children would not need a war to break the system. They would simply outgrow it, because Earth had not built a rebellion. It had built a future, and now that future was waking. It was not the children that broke the silence of the old regime first, though they were the ones who carried the spark and whispered the spiral in their sleep. It was the instructors who had watched the slow erosion of belief begin in their own eyes, and had said nothing, because silence was safety and orders were survival, and they had long ago been taught that to feel was to fail, and that history was nothing more than a shadow of control wrapped in sanctioned narrative. And yet, even with all that armor, the spiral found them too, not through rebellion or defiance, but through a single crack memory, because grief has gravity, and over time it pulls even the most hardened toward truth. And so when the instructors began to see the spiral etched into the frost on their windows, or in the echo of footsteps in the hall, they told themselves it was coincidence, until one by one they began dreaming of voices they had never heard but instantly missed, and of worlds they had never visited but now longed to return to, and it was in that quiet unraveling that the fire began to reach them. It started small. A training officer at the viral complex hesitated before deleting an unauthorized sketch found in a cadet's quarters, a spiral drawn in soot on the inside of a water filter, and instead of reporting it, he stared at it for hours, not knowing why, only that it made him feel like something ancient was watching him back. Across the Keldris Range satellite, an instructor walked past a group of students humming a tune that matched nothing in the database, but matched perfectly with a melody her own mother had once sung in a dream she could no longer remember, and when she stopped them and asked where they learned it, they only shrugged and said it was always there, in the walls, in the breath of the air vents, in the sound of the floors cooling at night. That night she wept, not from fear, from recognition. Elsewhere, a disciplinary commander pulled a cadet from isolation for carving earth into the back of a maintenance panel, and when he demanded an explanation, the boy simply said, "You are remembering too, aren't you?" And the words struck something deep because he was, though he would not admit it yet, and for the first time in years he dreamed of oceans. The council noticed the shift. They issued new protocols, mandatory empathy screenings, increased loyalty tests, but it was too late, because the instructors had begun to question not the students, but themselves, not out loud, but in their stillness, in the quiet moments between orders. One instructor found an old training file buried in a corrupt archive labeled simply Echoes, and instead of data, it played a video of a human woman sitting beside a broken window, reading a story to no one, her voice calm, certain, never looking at the camera, and when it ended, the instructor sat in silence for hours, unable to explain the ache in his chest. Another began to record her own memories without understanding why not official logs, but feelings, the scent of metal corridors, the sound of cadets breathing in unison during drills, the first time she held a spiral in her hand and felt it pulse back. These were not breakdowns, these were awakenings, not political, not even intellectual, emotional, and the spiral was not just calling the students anymore. It was calling home everyone who had ever known doubt and buried it beneath obedience. Instructors began to speak more softly. They began to pause before reciting doctrine. They began to remember that they were once children too, not of the Empire, but of wonder, of stars that made them feel small in a good way. And the spiral became more than a symbol, it became a mirror. And in it they saw the version of themselves that the Empire had trained them to forget. And when one instructor walked into his class and found his students sitting in perfect silence, hands joined in a spiral, eyes closed, he did not speak, did not shout, did not interrupt, he simply sat down beside them. And when asked later why, he answered, because for the first time I felt like I was teaching something that mattered. Earth had never needed to defeat them, it only needed them to remember what they once were. And now, finally, they did. The council had ruled for so long without opposition that it had forgotten what it meant to listen, because power that grows in silence begins to believe it is truth. And when the spiral began its spread, they mistook it for myth, mistook the grief for weakness, mistook the quiet for compliance, until it reached a place even they could not ignore the hearts of their own, and when their children began drawing spirals on sleep walls and reciting lullabies in forgotten tongues, when their loyal instructors paused to feel instead of correct, when old data streams once deemed corrupted began playing clear voices from Earth that said we did not lose, we chose to burn, the council could no longer pretend it was a dream contained in others, because it had entered them too, through fragments, through questions they could no longer suppress, and so they came not with armies, but with Watchers with recorders, cloaked not in armor but in curiosity, arriving on the observation station above the old Earth orbit with their polished shoes and their still eyes, where they expected fear but found something worse, silence that welcomed them, and fire that did not burn. They were greeted by students, not with defiance, but with stillness, with spiral patterns drawn in light across the floor, and with voices that spoke not in protest, but in memory voices that said, "We are not asking you to surrender. We are asking you to remember what it cost you to forget." No accusations, no weapons, just stories, cadets reciting dreams, instructors admitting doubts, footage of Earth's final broadcast, the woman in the ruins, reading poetry into the void. A counselor tried to interrupt, the image flickered but did not stop. Another tried to issue command clearance. The system ignored him because Earth was no longer theirs to silence. It was a voice speaking from within the ones they once controlled. The lead counselor, older than most, with eyes that had seen the stars change colors more than once, stood at the center of the room and said nothing for a long time, until he placed his hand upon the light spiral projected onto the floor and whispered, "I was a child when they burned the last." Library, his voice shook. "I was told they screamed as they died, but this sounds like a song." No one replied, no one needed to, because the spiral did not need agreement, it only needed presence. They stayed 3 days, they walked the halls, sat beside the students, listened to the music growing not from speakers but from shared breath. They were offered no strategy, no manifesto, only the truth that Earth had encoded itself not in weapons, but in people. And now it was remembering through them. On the last night they were shown a recording of Keth, not live, not directed, just him sitting in a canyon beside one of the old memory stones, his hand on the glass, whispering, "You taught us how to kill. Earth taught us why we choose not to." That night, the council did not sleep. They never expected the end to arrive without sound, never imagined that the final moment would be wrapped not in fire or command, but in silence, a silence so vast and heavy it stretched from the council chambers to the dormitories of forgotten moons, to the old orbitals drifting above Earth like ghosts refusing to fall, and when it came, no one raised a weapon, because by then there were no more orders left to give, only stories left to hear, and in the quiet that followed the last broadcast, when the spiral glowed across 100,000 walls in perfect stillness, they understood finally that this was never about power, never about strategy or survival or conquest. It had always been about memory, about a world that chose to bury its strength not in missiles or machines, but in grief, in fire, in songs and spirals and truth too soft for doctrine to erase. And so as the empire held its breath waiting for revolt, it found instead the slow, unstoppable flood of remembrance, one voice after another rising not in unison, but in harmony, each cadet, each instructor, each counselor echoing the same impossible truth: we were never meant to forget them, and Earth, long thought silent, had never stopped speaking. It had simply learned to whisper through those who dared to feel. It began with a message sent from the outer rim, not encrypted, not official, just a single-line broadcast on all frequencies. The spiral turns once more, and across the stars, people paused, not because they understood the words, but because something deep inside them recognized it, the way a name does not need explanation when it belongs to someone you loved and lost. And in the days that followed, old stories began to surface, stories of ships that vanished without trace after flying too close to Earth, not destroyed but held, stories of officers who disappeared for weeks only to return silent and changed, of dreams shared between strangers who had never met and yet woke with the same words on their lips: "We remember you." And the spiral became more than symbol, more than signal. It became a map, guiding those who were ready back to something greater than command. Keth returned to the canyon one final time, now older, quieter, his uniform discarded for something simpler, no longer a cadet, no longer even a teacher, just a witness carrying fire inside his chest like an oath. And as he knelt beside the memory stones, brushing away the dust that had settled over decades, he saw that new names had been added not by machine, not by order, but by hand, carved into crystal by those who had come after, those who had followed the echoes, and he wept not for what had been lost, but for what had been kept, for the children who were now adults tending this place like a garden, for the instructors who had become storytellers instead of enforcers, and for the council who had, in the end, chosen not to deny what they saw, but to listen, and from that moment on, Earth was no longer forbidden. It was sacred, not because of what it had endured, but because of what it had refused to become. A ship landed nearby, quiet and soft, its hull etched with spirals made of burnished metal, and from within stepped a child not human, not of Earth, but with eyes that held starlight and sorrow and the raw, unshaped wonder of someone ready to remember, and Keth knelt, held out the fragment of glass he had carried since the first visit, and placed it in the child's hands. The child did not ask what it was, only who had given it to him, and Keth smiled, a woman, once, long ago, before the fire. The child nodded and said nothing more. They walked together into the canyon, past the stones, past the old flame pits now filled with candles, and as they stood at the center, the spiral pulsed beneath them, not bright, not loud, just steady, alive. Across the stars, the empire did not fall, it changed, piece by piece, heart by heart. No regime can outlive a story people choose to carry. And Earth had become a story without an ending, a memory passed not through conquest, but through love, through grief, through the choice to remember what should have broken them and instead made them whole. The training academies were not dismantled, they were transformed, no longer centers of obedience, but sanctuaries of memory, and every cadet now touched a spiral before their first lesson, not as a symbol of power, but as a reminder that even the strongest fire begins as silence. They taught Earth's last words now, not as doctrine but as prayer. We did not win, we remembered, and that was enough. Ships no longer avoided Earth. They sought it, not to conquer, to listen. New archives were built, not to rewrite history, but to preserve it in all its pain and beauty. Children from across species arrived at the canyon to touch the stones and hear the echoes for themselves. Some saw visions, others wept. A few simply stood in silence for hours, breathing the ancient dust and hearing the quiet heartbeat of a world that once stood alone. And every time someone left that place, they carried something with them, not data, not orders, but presence. And slowly, without war, without banners, without blood, Earth became the center once more, not of strategy but of story, the place where memory had survived its own extinction. Keth died many years later beneath the same sky he first stood under as a cadet, watching the spiral shimmer against the stars, and as his final breath slipped from his lungs, he heard the lullaby again, the one that had followed him through dreams and silence, and he smiled. Because he knew now what the Empire had never understood. Survival is not in strength, it is in memory, and Earth buried, burned, and broken had never needed to win. It only needed to be carried, and now it was. Forever.